speaker, and his name is Jake Hirsch-Allen, and he'll be speaking about data and online learning, the future of work and learning. And by the time I'm done reading his bio, he will be mic'd up and ready to roll. Jake, welcome back to the stage. I think it was 2 years ago that we first met and you spoke here. It's great to have you back. Jake currently leads economic graph, higher education, and workforce development at LinkedIn Canada. He's a director on the board of the Canadian Club, teaches global health at McMaster University, and is on the advisory boards of the Hot Doc Cinema and Code for Canada. I also see, every time I see Jake mention something on LinkedIn or social, he's on a plane going somewhere. So you know he's a busy guy. He founded Lighthouse Labs, Canada's foremost software development bootcamp, and Hacking Health. A former intellectual property and international criminal lawyer, Jake was also chair of the Technology Committee of the Global Education Platform and clerked at the Supreme Court of Israel. Welcome back, Jake. It's good to see you again.
Thanks so much for having me. Good to be back. We've got a small crew. We'll keep it cozy. I'll come up to the front. Thank you guys all for coming. I'm going to go through the slides real quick. Who here has ever seen me talk before? We got one. Hey. Amazing. Okay, so that means that I'm not going to be redundant at all. So I'll go through. It's basically the same first few slides, and then it's all new because the role's changed a lot since the last time I was on this stage. And I'm excited to sort of walk through that progression, particularly when it comes to online learning and how education and now workforce development, governments are using data in order to do their work more efficiently. So the overarching meta story here is around closing skills gaps. And if you keep that in mind as we go through, you'll see I start a bit about sort of me and introductions and what LinkedIn's data is. I talk a bit about what labor market information we have and how it could apply to your lives and to the lives of the post-secondaries and workforce development organizations that I work with. And then we'll get into some really specific examples of what we're doing with schools and what LinkedIn's doing in online learning. So really quickly on me, I think I already got the intro, so I won't go into that too much, but I've got a pretty bizarre background for somebody working at LinkedIn doing business development and government relations type stuff. Having come from international criminal law and intellectual property law, my focus really was trying to right human wrongs through those systems, and eventually ended up in access to medicines via the IP law work, and there was asked to work on access to educations at an international level with folks like Gordon Brown, who's now the UN Special Envoy for Education, and with a lot of the leaders of the top tech companies working in this space. Think edX, Coursera, OECD, Brookings, that kind of folk. And the interesting part about that conversation was we came to the conclusion that the fundamental problem in online learning, and particularly access for disadvantaged populations, is not anything to do with the learning platforms themselves. So for instance, in access to medicines, we were trying to figure out how to fix some market issues that were really, really challenging access. In education, it has nothing to do with the market. Instead, it's everything else about the people trying to access that education that has to be fixed. So you need broadband, you need access to the internet, but also you need the mental health, you need the access to food in order to consume the education. And so a ton of what I've been doing more and more recently is working with the organizations that provide all of those wraparound services. So LinkedIn's got a lot of data, right? That's really what drives the vast majority of what we do now is the information that you all upload to our platform, but also the information that companies add when they post a job, or that schools add when they list their programs. And so you can see here it's our members, it's the company profiles, it's the jobs that are on our platform, in some cases paid, in some cases not. And what I spend the most time focusing on is this, skills. So in particular, we're looking at, for instance, the largest ontology or dictionary of skills that exists in the entire world. And it's up to date because when you add a new skill to your profile that say we've never heard of, like a new version of a software or maybe even a new field, right? You're working in an area of design that we've never heard of. All of a sudden when you do that, it enters into our ontology. And if 3 people do that, then we start to catalog it and make it available to other members. And once it gets to a certain level, we're actually drawing what are called crosswalks between those skills in this database and what the Canadian government defines as what's called a NOC code, or in the US is an ONET code. So we're making links between the public data sources and ours. Sorry for the audio challenges. And the last thing up here is schools, because that's what I've been working with for the past few years, Canada's post-secondary institutions, on how they can teach better, on how they can use our data and our learning content in order to teach. But interestingly, what I found when I worked with them, and I'll explain this story in more depth a little later, was that we were missing a big part of the system. Half of the money that's spent in Canada, half of the billions of dollars that's spent on education and skills development is spent in higher education. The other half is spent in employment services. And it's that other half that I think has often been left out by tech companies, by those who are trying to plan for the future of work and learning. And that's why I'm happy to really bring those systems together as part of my ambit at LinkedIn. So you add up all this data and we call it the economic graph. It's our picture from a human capital perspective of the world, of the economy, right? We see the economy through the lens of your profiles and of jobs being posted, et cetera. And this 3D map can tell us things that we still haven't discovered about what that world looks like. So for instance, this is a deck that I put together, or from a deck that I put together for a meeting between the head of LinkedIn Canada, the heads of something called the Business Council of Canada, so that's the top 130 CEOs in Canada. They represent about a third of the economy. Satya, the head of Microsoft, which is now our parent company, and Jeff Weiner, the head of LinkedIn. And what they talked about was how we could all work together to grow Canada's economy. And the one thing that everybody agreed on was the thing that was on the first slide today. Closing skills gaps is the way that we can grow our economy most efficiently. Now, those were all big private companies, and they were really focused on economic growth. Personally, I thought they missed something important, which is not just how to grow it efficiently and productively, but also how to grow it inclusively. And so today I'm going to be talking about both of those things. Speaking of inclusion, this is from the first economic graph study we ever did in Toronto. So 4 years ago, we had a meeting where we brought the head of Seneca College, Mayor Tory, the head of the YMCA, and a variety of other organizations together to talk about what our data could do for them. And we decided to run a test. If we researched what skills were most important for somebody early in their career in tech, and then provided that to the institutions that were actually delivering education to those individuals, could we get them jobs faster? Could we get them jobs more sustainably, jobs that they actually stayed in for their entire careers or at least for a number of years? And move over here. All right, thank you. And the short answer was, we think so. So already, when I put this slide up to test it, to validate it, we hadn't even tested this kind of data before with public individuals out in the open. When we did that for the first time, somebody at Seneca took a screen cap. And they literally created the boot camp so that by the time we launched the project, they already had 18 students who'd gone through and been placed in companies. Fast forward 3 years, there's now been 14 of those boot camps, all funded by the province, and they seem like a great way to get people into jobs. For me, there was something personally validating about that as well, because before joining LinkedIn, I'd started Lighthouse Labs, which is now probably Canada's largest software development boot camp, and it had proven, at least in the private career college space, that this model was successful. But we only have a very small number of disadvantaged youth coming into Lighthouse Labs. It's a pretty small organization as a whole, and you can imagine organizations like Seneca with tens of thousands of students coming through every year could actually do a lot more for this population. The other interesting thing about this slide is, if you look at number 4, it says Adobe Fireworks. So I'm assuming this being DigiFest, some folks in the audience have used Fireworks. Anybody? No? So Fireworks is used to create Flash. You guys know what Flash is? Yeah, we got some nods now. You can't use Flash on any mobile device anymore. So this was 4 years ago, and that skill, the most in-demand skill for somebody early in their career in tech, is completely obsolete. And that's just indicative of how fast skills are changing, right? It's impossible for a Seneca or a U of T, a George Brown, or a Red River College to keep up with that pace of change. They can't build content fast enough for the pace of the workforce's actual demands. And the result is a greater need for public-private collaboration. In-class faculty members can be doing things like building the human and foundational skills that can't be learned online. And online, we can update content. Massive companies like LinkedIn or edX or others can update content much more quickly than any given brick and mortar institution can. And so that realization is beginning to spread, not just within individual institutions, but also at the level of systems. And for me, that was important because my job originally was to sell lynda.com, now LinkedIn Learning, to individual colleges and universities. And in the north, in northern Ontario or northern BC, small 100 or 500 or 1,000 person colleges couldn't afford it. We sold at scale. The more licenses you buy, the less it costs. And the problem with that is when you're U of T, it doesn't cost very much per license and you have a lot of money. But when you're at Canadore College or Algoma University, you don't have those resources. And so we were actually perpetuating inequality just based on the way that almost all software as a service is sold. And so I spent a while and I tried to figure out, okay, how do we flip that on its head? How do we provide more access to those who need it most? And the province at the time had this highly skilled workforce initiative. They were trying to upskill citizens province-wide in a more organized and efficient manner. And through that, we ended up funding access for Lynda for every post-secondary in Ontario. So it was 1 million licenses. And it was the first time, crazily, that LinkedIn had ever done a public-private partnership. It was the first time that we had sold to government, not for government employees, but for citizens, for us. And that changed how we began thinking about working with governments. Since then, we have had governments from literally around the world, entire countries saying, can we do the same thing? Can we work with you to provide online learning access to all 9 million or 15 million of our citizens? And so those conversations are happening right now. But as I said, we missed something, which is when Humber College or George Brown College is working with non-students, when they're working with the people who really need a job, somebody who's on employment services and who's maybe getting unemployment insurance or on Ontario Works benefits, those individuals often don't get access to these resources because the government doesn't pay for them to get access to these resources. So the most disadvantaged people, again, aren't getting access to the same resources that, say, somebody who can pay for a George Brown education can. And the result was that we moved beyond higher education to think about the workforce more generally. And so as we began doing that, we began engaging government across different levels, not just on the learning side, on the content side, but also on the data side. So we've done a number of different economic graph projects, research projects around our data over the past 4 years, but this is actually, to jump to about a month ago, the most recent one. And most of this data isn't public yet. So you can take a screen cap, but it's intentionally small. It probably won't look very good. And that's in part because we literally haven't made most of this information public. And what it does is it shows what skills are in demand now in different parts of Canada. So in Toronto, we've got one of these for every major city in Canada, for every province in Canada. And what's interesting is it's often quite different than what the government data is saying about the same thing because provinces have data updated about every 5 to 10 years. The census, again, every 5 to 10 years at a federal level. CRA obviously has more up-to-date information from our taxes, and what I'm trying to do is connect all of those systems. They're in databases that look pretty similar. We actually, as I said, have crosswalks between many of those databases. So let's open them all up, connect them with privacy reassured, with data maybe in a trust or sitting in a blockchain protected database. And let's ensure that we're then using it to help schools, to help employment service organizations develop curriculum fast. One of the other interesting things about this slide is you see retail sales up there. That seems to be one of the most in-demand skills, like uniquely in-demand skills in Canada. And it's because we have a lot of different industries that intersect with retail, and we actually have a relatively low penetration of things like Amazon. So we have the highest penetration of LinkedIn in the world after the Netherlands, and we have a relatively low penetration of Amazon. Distance, there's a variety of other factors that of course play into that, but I think teasing out what that means for our economy is really important for a variety of public and private sector actors. The other thing we're trying to do with governments is actually combine our data so that you can see it in real time on the platform. So in the US, in over 40 states, half of the traffic going to an employment service provider or to a job bank is coming from us. What that means is instead of having to go on to jobs.gc.ca to find those job bank jobs, you just go onto LinkedIn and search for a job. And the jobs that are being directed to the entire population, often to less advantaged parts of the population, are popping up there. And we're pushing people to them. So figuring out how to do that more efficiently, I think will also help the sort of parts of the pyramid that aren't necessarily as valuable from an economic growth perspective but are even more valuable from an inclusive growth perspective. So I'm going to skip through pretty quickly the slides that I have on LinkedIn Learning. Who in the room knows what LinkedIn Learning is? Okay, we've got a few. So most of you have experienced this. There's some stuff that I think is actually new, you probably haven't seen. So in fact, I'm almost certain, has anyone seen this screen before? No. Okay, so this is what you can see on the back end of LinkedIn Learning when you have administrative rights, and you can see what skills you all are learning within the organization. So at a university, you can see, oh, X person or X class is growing in this skill, whereas Y class is growing in this skill set, which I think is interesting. The screen that I don't have a screenshot of, but is rolling out like any day now. We've only seen it on the back end side, so we can access it, but clients can't. But literally any day, we'll have something called a skills match index, which will match what a program is teaching. So to the extent that a program lists its objectives on LinkedIn, we can then match the skills that that's producing on people's profiles, so graduates who have that program on their profile, to the skills that are in demand in an industry. So an industry obviously posts a bunch of jobs, and those jobs have skills. Individuals graduating from a program have skills, and we say, how well do those align? We only tell people within the organization that is providing the LinkedIn Learning this, so it's not reporting back to the government. This might be raising triggers related to different government funding mechanisms that have been coming up recently. And we limit it to competition, so to speak, within those programs. But at a minimum, you're getting to see how effective the school is at delivering the skills that people need to get jobs in a specific industry. And I think that's what, as an economy as a whole, we can do better. The other aspect is how to upload your own content. And here, the only reason I put this in was because we're doing a really interesting project with Civic Action, which is a Toronto NGO. I'm seeing some nodding heads, so folks know it. Every year for the past 4 years, we've hosted an event where we have hundreds of people receiving employment services, so disadvantaged Torontonians come and meet up with LinkedIners and receive some mentorship on how to use LinkedIn to get a job. Great, but not particularly scalable. I think that's the largest, we were at 500 or 600. This past year, we started something, instead of Youth Connect, it's also Skills Connect. And what they're doing is they're using LinkedIn Learning, they're adding civic action content and other content. So for instance, we're having a conversation with the First Nations Technology Council of BC about building Indigenous first content in BC and really using our content only to fill in gaps there. And the idea is now we can actually build Canadian values into the platform for a distinct user base, because it's not just LinkedIn American-made content, it's content that we make together. And while I don't think we should be hosting all of it on our platform, I think Desire to Learn's Brightspace and YouTube and there's lots of other places where content should be both hosted and distributed. I think this idea that we can combine content in a way that, again, that acknowledges the value of where someone is and of their culture and of their community and of the distinctness of that, the nuances there, is really, really important. So this is my big ambition for Canada. I spent most of yesterday in Ottawa, and we met with everybody from the Prime Minister's office through to a dozen ministries. And we've been doing this every few weeks for almost a year now, because we're trying to figure out how we can work together on one big ambition, which is give anybody who can't pay for it access to all of the same privileges on LinkedIn that those of us who can pay for it have. Get any person receiving an employment service, a social service, so if you're differently abled or if you're Indigenous, if you are a newcomer coming to Canada or a disadvantaged youth, if you're a mid-career worker who's just been displaced from work, any of those populations already receive services from different levels of government. Let's ensure that they all have access to a LinkedIn license. Let's ensure that they have access to our learning and skills development, not just from us, but also from other organizations online. And let's make sure that they have access, this is the new part, to job matching at the same level that somebody who can pay for it, pay for a gold license can. And while sure this is driving a lot of new people onto LinkedIn, the more important part is it's going to teach individuals the value of networking, of mentorship, of searching for a job, of online learning, basic digital literacy as well. It's going to give the government real-time data on how they're progressing. We're going to have to figure out how to ensure that data is extremely privacy protected. Arguably, LinkedIn is better at that already than any government in Canada. certainly than many of our competitors in the online space. And I also think there's really interesting things we can do in terms of even legal ownership of that data. What about a data trust? And this is Jake, not LinkedIn speaking. But what if in the contract we said every Canadian owns their own data? So when they want it back from CRA or from StatsCan, from LinkedIn or from Facebook, we can download it in much the same way that Europe is sort of moving towards with the GDPR, but maybe even a way that goes beyond it, that is distinctly Canadian. So that's the idea. I think that's all I got for today. Any questions? Nada. Silence. Go for it. Got a mic? Yeah. Here it comes. Got some feedback. Awesome. Hey.
Thank you for presentation. Just a quick question. Did you investigate the possibility to introduce skill levels? Like when you have a skill, like for example, you're playing a game, you're getting upgrades, right? So like I've seen that number 2 in demand is communication skill. So how would you, for example, evaluate a person saying,
on different levels?
Yeah.
It's a great question. Communication is actually a particularly hard one. So I would say on communication, I think you're way better off having a brick and mortar institution, thank you, or an individual. Yeah, just use this, awesome. Having that kind of institution evaluate your communication skills, because really you got to do it in person, at a minimum on video. But I don't think it should be through a standardized test or quiz. In fact, assessment in general, I think, is best left to a variety of types of institutions that are not as far away from the individual in physical or technological, in cultural or other terms as we are. That's like sort of like the human foundational side. In terms of a really technical skill, so let's say how good you are at a coding language, or even better, your proficiency with a piece of software, with using a piece of software. In that respect, if you've gone through the content associated with how to use Photoshop X, then I think we can say, okay, here's the basic content, here's the intermediate content, here's the more advanced content. And in fact, the Project Management Institute of North America and dozens of other partners are already doing that with our platform. It's actually one of the areas I like. I like showing off the collaboration that we're doing with other companies. So Microsoft is our parent company. We have the Google Android certifications on LinkedIn Learning. And I think that's important because these should be open ecosystems where we all teach each other's skills. But even then, if you actually wanted to open up the code and evaluate how creative the individual was, you'd probably be better off having an individual from your organization doing that, because they're going to have a really different perspective on that than LinkedIn would, or than I would. Does that make sense? So again, personally, I don't think evaluation is going to be our forte. And as of yet, we don't do much of it at all.
Any other questions from the audience? We'll run a mic over to you. Raise your hand up high. Yes. One of my favorite students. Thank you for coming.
Well, I'm glad I'm a favorite. Since you're working with the Government of Canada, I wondered about, are there requirements for bilingual content?
Yeah, great question. So we've got content in 6 languages. So LinkedIn bought Linda 4 years ago. A few years before that, Linda bought a company called Video to Brain in Austria. And Video to Brain had been creating native content content natively in 6 languages for a long time before that. So right now, the top 1,500 or so of our courses, we've got around 13,000 in total. The top 1,500 are already recorded natively in at least 4 other languages. French, Spanish, German, Portuguese, Japanese, Mandarin is coming, although we're just getting started, and there's one other I'm missing. What I find interesting is those languages are being recorded faster than English. So they're growing, relatively speaking, faster than our English content, because also, like, if you look at where LinkedIn is growing in the world, it's growing a lot faster in Brazil and India than it is in North America. So the short answer is we've got it. The long answer is it's still coming. And also, if you look at some of Microsoft's real-time translation tools, it's in some cases better than our native translation. It's like we're getting really, really close with real-time translation. It's better in text than spoken. There's a variety of challenges, but I think pretty soon we won't even bother with people doing the native recordings. And this is, again, me, not any official line. I'm seeing it coming in some ways. Anyone else?
Any questions from the audience? Jake, you mentioned before that there's Well, when you mentioned the flash course, it actually reminded me that I had a similar conversation with one of the coordinators, or whatever they call each other, the chairman, saying that there was a flash course in the undergraduate program of the School of Design up until 4 years ago. That coincides with what you're saying there, which is, and I completely can side with you in saying that undergraduate programs with the red tape move at a snail's pace to adapt to current technology. But I haven't seen that barrier, and I'm not, by the way, I'm not a full-time educator for those out there. I just do it sometimes. I am an active in the industry and then teach what I do in the evenings to adults. And it's in the non-accredited forms of education that we're able to teach the stuff that happens on a day-to-day. Does that sort of mirror with what your strategy is here? Is if we go non-accredited, then we don't have to worry about the funding from the government and the red tape involved in somebody approving it, because those who are taking those courses are dishing it out from their own pocket to learn a new skill themselves. And it's skills taught like people like me that do these things every day for $1 million clients.
Totally. I think it's not as strategic or intentional as you're describing, but you're capturing a zeitgeist that goes well beyond what LinkedIn's doing, where we're moving towards micro-credentials and badges. Actually, the best example I've seen is in Europe, where they talk about recognition. So any form of recognition of your being able to do something, whether it's a concrete skill or something more abstract, is as valuable as the piece of paper that I got after my 3 years at McGill. And the result is that if we can somehow make that recognition as accessible as possible, ideally universally accessible, and again, LinkedIn doesn't do this great in my opinion, because for instance, a lot of the open badging systems are by definition open. They've got amazing APIs, they've got amazing connections to tons of other software platforms, so that all of a sudden I say, oh, you can do an amazing job at hosting an event, therefore you have some degree of recognition for that on this badging platform, you get a little badge for it, and then ideally it would be pushed to LinkedIn. And even better, and this is sort of my macro dream, we would have one labor market infrastructure system for the whole world. We wouldn't have all of these different standards for how a country assesses a skill or an occupation, or how I recognize your skills. We would just have one database. And that database would have to be filtered in some ways so that local organizations and groups could really create their own cultures. And then perhaps once they got to a certain level of standardization, be added to this international labor market infrastructure. There's a guy named John Schell at Social Capital Partners here in Toronto who's written about an international space station of work that would do this. But yeah, in short, you're absolutely right. We're moving away from degrees, away from credentials. And I think governments can actually fund the same. They could, as this government even here in Ontario is doing, they could look more and more at micro-credentials and badges and other forms of recognition, and less at degrees.
Now, I've seen this happening for more than 5 years. This shift away from the BA being valuable, the MBA being as valuable, and more about micro-learning, like 3 or 4 different certificates in focused areas become more attractive, easier to accomplish, and easier to add on to your levels of education. And I think now what I'm getting from you is you're looking to standardize the non-accredited so that there can be some additional value added to it. Is that the case?
Precisely. Exactly.
Awesome. Any other questions from the audience for Jake? Raise your hand nice and high, and we'll run a mic over to you.
We're golden?
All right, if not, we're going to wrap up. Thanks so much, Jake Hirsch-Allen, everybody. And that wraps up our programming for the afternoon, everyone. Don't forget there are studio tours that you can attend.